Yeah, everyone, this session, this GNT is recorded. So I believe everyone have gave your consent throughout the registration form. So just feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want to be recorded for this event. Just to give some introduction, this GNT is produced in association with Journal of Global Aging, the very exciting new journal, a transdisciplinary journal committed to advancing our understanding of the global process of aging. And today we have Professor Martin Hyde, the editorial lead of the journal, to give us some tips on how to publish your research. Professor Martin Hyde is also is the professor of management in School of Business, University of Leicester. So I will give the floor to you, Martin.
Awesome, and thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak to ERA, who I think are just amazing, particularly in kind of supporting early career researchers in gerontology. And again, hopefully this talk could be useful, and hopefully some of you by the end of it might even consider submitting to the BSG's new journal. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that has worked okay. Is that fine?
Yep, we can see that.
Perfect. So basically today, I'm just going to sort of try and give you a insight into what I think editors look for, and particularly I think what sort of editors within gerontology journals look for. And mostly this is kind of based on my experience of working in various journals over a period of time. I'm not going to speak for the full hour. I'd like to try and keep this really to about sort of 20-25 minutes, because I think the best use of this time is really to kind of be open for questions and comments. Either people want to raise their hands or put something in chat. If you don't feel like you want to do that, or if an idea strikes you or question that you might have after the session, please feel free to contact me either on my email or DM me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called nowadays. So just to sort of give a little bit of background about me, I mean, I don't sort of normally do this, but I am, I suppose, asking you to have some kind of faith in what I'm saying about what editors look for. So I've been involved in editorial processes for various journals, going back, I suppose, back to 2014, 2015. And I must admit, it's been an incredibly rewarding, if not sometimes incredibly hard work. But it gives you, I think, a real opportunity to see the review, submission, publication process in its entirety, and give you some idea about the sorts of things that you can do to improve your chances of firstly getting off the editor's desk, then hopefully through the review process, and then ultimately to be kind of successfully published. I should say that there's no guarantee of being published anywhere now. And I suppose a caveat that I'm sure most of you are aware of, that many journals are kind of having a bit of a hard time at the moment in finding reviewers. So I suppose there's an implicit call there for people not only to kind of look for opportunities to get involved in editorial roles, but also in the meantime to kind of take opportunities to review papers for journals as well, because that gives you insights into what journals are looking for, which hopefully you could use to kind of strengthen your own papers. So I have given a sort of variants of this talk in various places. And one of the things that sort of struck me early on is that there is quite a lot of sort of mystery or maybe sort of obfuscation around this whole review submission process. So people are very kind of, I suppose, aware of the review part of it, but maybe don't necessarily understand the roles that editors play in this process. So I just thought I'd sort of sketch this out so we can see really the importance of the role of the editor at the crucial stages in the review process, in the sort of submission process. And I suppose to kind of get you thinking that whilst obviously you want to be writing good papers in and of themselves, making sure that you address the needs of the editor are also really important in terms of getting your paper successfully through the process. And then the bit I suppose that most people sort of aren't maybe even less aware of is this first stage in the process, which is undertaken by the journal administrator, that often checks that the submission meets some of the requirements of the journal itself. So things like word count, proper formatting, whether your abstract is structured or unstructured, whether the references are in the appropriate order. So that's also an incredibly important part that I think some authors maybe don't necessarily give sufficient credence to, but I've known in many cases papers being sent back to their authors because they've failed to meet these initial checks. So again, very important to get on this track in the submission process and make sure you don't fall at these kind of early hurdles. So whilst obviously as researchers, we're super excited about the research we're doing, we're super passionate about kind of writing the paper, trying to get it out there, trying to share our ideas with the wider readership, but you need to also kind of make sure that you don't lose sight of some of these very technical things that you need to do in order to get into that process in the first place. Once you get past that stage, your paper will then be assigned to one of the editors at the journal. So most journals have a sort of an editorial board, an editorial structure where you'll have like an editor-in-chief, a couple of deputy editors, and associate editors. And the paper will be distributed amongst one of these or to one of these. And this is a point that I'm going to come back to later in the talk. It is unlikely that the editor that will be assigned your paper will be a subject specialist. I mean, they'll be working in the area of aging, but they won't necessarily be working in your area of aging, because their job really is to act as a gatekeeper, to look at whether the paper meets certain criteria for the journal, and then to find reviewers who they think are the subject experts in order to be able to send them out. They will, hopefully, most often be a methods specialist, so they will understand the methods that you're using. So, you know, I'm a quantitative researcher, so I tend to get sent the quant papers for any of the journals that I've tended to work on. So in that sense, we know that or we can make assessments about whether the methods are robust enough to be able to send out, or whether there are any problems in terms of you know, in the worst case, kind of fraudulent methods being used or fraudulent results being presented, or whether they're kind of ethical issues about what's being done in terms of the data collection. If we pass all those kind of checks and that kind of level of interest, the paper gets sent out to the two reviewers who clearly, you know, share their wisdom with the editor, and then, or share their wisdom about the paper, and then that comes back to the editor. And again, it's the editor that makes the decision about how to progress. They obviously have the recommendations from the reviewer, but again, the editor plays that crucial role in looking at the reviewer's comments, hopefully the paper again itself, and making their decision about what should happen to the paper, and if it is a revise and resubmit, what comments to go forward, and what comments they feel are particularly salient for the author to consider. So whilst a lot of us are focused on the reviewer, and I think, you know, if anybody's on social media, there's the kind of the perennial complaint about reviewer 2 and the power that they have in determining whether your paper gets published. But looking at this flow, you can see that editors play a really crucial role in kind of two very key stages in the life of a paper. So what do I think the editor's role consists of? And I think this is kind of quite important, because I think that there is an assumption in some areas that the purpose of journals is to publish academic papers, whatever those papers are, and that it's sort of an academic service that needs to be performed. Whereas, again, anyone who's been across some of the stories around academic publishing will be very aware that it is largely driven by kind of business concerns. So academic publishing is an incredibly large and varied business, and, you know, policy press are on the social enterprise, social business side of that. But you also have the kind of publishing giants like Elsevier, who command a huge sort of amount of sort of market power. And as an editor for the journal, you are the representative for the academic reputation for that journal. So you are there to ensure that the journal doesn't publish things that could bring it into disrepute, that could somehow tarnish the quality of other papers that are being published there. You're also there to act in the interest of the publisher as well, and in the case of journals like Journal of Global Aging, of the professional society. So you also want to make sure that you're doing things that benefit those organizations, those interests. So again, making sure that in this case, the journal has adds social value, has a kind of a social mission in terms of sort of making sure we have an inclusive approach to our readership and our kind of authorship, as well as our editorial board. We also therefore, like I said, have a technical responsibility to find reviewers for papers. And again, if we think about what that means is, again, some of that means relying on our personal contacts, so people that we know who we think we can kind of ask, but also learning how to use those editorial management systems to be able to find reviewers as well and make judgments about the quality of the potential reviewers that we're going to get. So again, there's a lot of variability in how editors can do that that can impact on the nature of the kind of submission and publications process. We also have to liaise with our journal administrators in order to make sure that we're getting timely communication out to authors and reviewers and make sure everything's ticking along okay. And I will attest the journal administrators are very good at kind of making sure that I stay on track as well, for doing lots of other things to make sure we promote the journal. And ultimately, we take decisions about the paper based on the expertise of the reviewer. So like I said, we take that information and we should play an active role in that process. I think one of the challenges that we are facing at the moment is because of the sheer volume of papers that are being submitted and because of time pressures on editors. Often as authors, we feel quite frustrated that we just get reviewers' comments passed on to us without any sort of real editorial involvement to help direct the author as to what the editor thinks is the most important, or where the editor might step in order to address comments that are seen as rude or unnecessary or sort of unprofessional. So again, I think editors need to kind of become more active in that role, and it's certainly something that we're trying to do at the Journal of Global Aging to make sure that we see this kind of process as more of a sort of a conversation between reviewers, editors and authors, so we all benefit and we all kind of feel like we're having a good experience in this process. So in terms of what happens in my case when a journal comes across my desk, so when I get sent so when a paper comes to me, I'm asked to kind of make a decision about it. The first thing that you have to check, or the first thing you check, is whether it fits the aims and scope of the journal. So if you go onto any of the journal pages for journals that you're looking to submit to, somewhere there will be the aims and scope of the journal, or the mission of the journal, so what the journal hopes to publish. And often, I mean, the most common reason why papers will get rejected at this stage, what we call the desk reject, so it doesn't go out to reviewers but is sent back to the author at this initial stage, is simply because it falls out of scope. So you could do all this work, writing your paper, getting it in really good shape, and then send it to a journal which you think, I don't know, maybe the title, or maybe someone's recommended it to you, you think, oh, that's worth looking at, that's worth sending it to, or someone's had a good experience there, but it's not in scope, it's not what the journal's looking to publish, and therefore the editor's just going to send it sort of straight back to you. So find the aims and scope, and if you can't find them, I think you should feel sort of able to contact either the journal office, so there'll be a contact page somewhere, or one of the senior editors of the journal to ask them to direct to the aims and scope. If it is in scope, then I want to know, is it clear what the paper's about? If I'm going to be sending the paper out to reviewers, I need to know what it's doing. So again, you can have wonderfully well-written or very sort of comprehensive literature reviews without really telling me what the journal is trying to do. So what the paper's trying to do. For me, then that becomes really difficult as an editor, because like I said, it's unlikely that I'm going to be the subject specialist. So I don't know whether it's making an original contribution to knowledge. So you need to be telling the editor, this is what it's doing, this is what I'm trying to do. And again, make sure that the title makes sense for the paper. does it give a clear indication about what the topic and the focus of the study is going to be about? Then I want to think, is it going to be of interest to our readership? So going back to that point about being a representative of the journal and of the professional society, the journal has a readership. We want to kind of encourage and kind of have a relationship with that readership. So I'm not going to kind of send papers out which I think aren't going to be read by them, because it's not going to be of any use for the readership of the journal, because it's not going to be of interest to them, nor is it going to be any use for the authors of the paper, because it's very unlikely it's going to get highly read or cited if it's not getting out to the people who are likely to engage with it. So you have to make an assessment there, and that's something of a subjective assessment, because you can't know the entirety of your readership. But anyone who's worked in journals will know that the publisher does a lot of sort of data gathering to see where the journal is being picked up, who's reading it, what sorts of papers are being cited, what sorts of papers are being read. So over time, you do get a feel for who your readership is and what sort of papers they're likely to enjoy reading. And then, because we live in a world where citations matter, both for authors, but also for journals, I want to have a think about whether it's going to be cited at all. So again, we don't want to be necessarily publishing things that aren't going to have an impact on the debate on our field. We want to be involved in stuff in that debate, in that discussion with our peers. And also we kind of want to also be looking out for those papers where we think this could have a really big impact, and looking for how we can kind of promote them. And then is the standard of writing good? I must admit, my English language competence isn't fantastic. I'm not after sort of perfect writing, but is it comprehensible? Is it a well-structured piece of work that clearly takes the reader through the narrative, the literature? That's a clear set of kind of objectives, aims, research questions, hypotheses, whatever they might happen to be. And again, he's very clear about what the methods are that we use to address those questions. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing to kind of say is that we also have to think about what the editor sees first. So I think it's a sort of a bit of a truism that we often do the first bits last when we come to write our papers. So we go away, we do our methods, we do our results, we get our findings, and then we write this wonderful abstract that presents everything as being this lovely, smooth, linear process. And we were going to go out and do the thing we did, and we're going to find the things that we found. But often we do this at the end of the process, sometimes very much as we're sort of submit at the point of submission, particularly for things like keywords. And again, I'm going to return to that in more detail at the end. But that's the first thing that we see. So as it comes to for an editor, that's our first impression. So having a really good, clear abstract title and well-defined keywords helps us with making decisions on that paper, and as I'll show later, ensuring that further down the line the paper goes to the right people in terms of the reviewing. So thinking about how to do this, I would say titles should be short and informative. Say what it does, say what you're looking at. I think there was a trend when I started in academia of incredibly long, whimsical, very knowing titles that no one outside of a very small niche in the field would actually understand. If we're actually trying to have an impact, not just in our kind of academic field, but more widely in society with non-academic stakeholder groups, we want people to know what it is they're getting when they find your paper. For editors as well, I want to know when I send it out to reviewers, they're not going to be confused about what the situation is. So as an example, on a journal that I've worked on, I sent out a paper that I thought it was very interesting, and I definitely thought it was worth being sent out to review. In the end, we ended up sending it to quite a large number of reviewers, and no one agreed to review it. And I think the problem was that in the title, it pitched itself as a literature review. And people just thought, well, I'm not going to read that. It's just a literature review, and I don't see that as being worthy of an academic paper. In fact, it was much more than a literature. It was a proper kind of systematic review that they'd done, and there was lots of like really interesting things in there. But just again, that very small thing in the title meant that the paper eventually had to end up being withdrawn because we simply couldn't find reviewers for it. So it's a very long process to do that. I mean, I'm not going to say how many reviewers we approached, but it was a significant number. And then everyone in that process feels slightly deflated. The reviewers feel like they're being sent stuff that isn't worthy. The authors are obviously very frustrated because they want to get stuff in review and they've written a good paper. And I, as an editor, felt quite frustrated because I could see the value of the paper and it just wasn't getting into review. And there's very little that I could do about that apart from keep sending it out. Make sure that you include good keywords. Again, I'll come back to this in a minute, but it's really helpful when we're looking for reviewers, but also post-publication in terms of the discoverability of your paper. And again, resist the urge to be overly complicated in your abstract. Again, I think it's to say what you did, or say what you're going to do, say what you did, say, again, remind people what you found. So keep it nice and clear in order to make sure that that first impression is very clear, so I know what it is and I can already start thinking about reviewers and where the paper sort of might end up. So the second sort of part then that we get to is the literature review, the introduction, the scene setting part of your paper. So I've said earlier that it's unlikely that the editor is going to be a subject specific expert, but obviously we all read the literature review. We want to make sure that it reads well, that it again is kind of has that natural flow, but we're not necessarily going to know or be able to make an assessment about its original contribution to knowledge. So tell the editor and the reviewer what it is that the paper does. What is it doing that you think means that it should be published in that journal? So again, I'm reminded of an earlier ERA presentation about how to write a 4-star paper, where again the presenter was saying, be really clear early on about what the value is of this paper, so the ref panel can effectively make that or kind of be assisted in making that decision. So again, I think that's good advice for publishing in general, but again, as we approach the next ref cycle, I think it's also a good practice to get into for that as well. So in terms of what I think makes a good literature review, so I mean I've thought about this for some time. Like I said, I've given variations of this talk and gone back and thought about, I suppose I've been involved in editing things for about 10 years or so. So what do I think makes for a really good literature review? And I think it's this, say what it is, say what you're looking at, what's the topic, say why it's important, so what it is that you're doing, why people should want to be interested, why people should want to read it, review what we know about it, so what does the evidence tell us. Personally, I think a kind of a narrative synthesis approach works really well for this because it allows you to evaluate the different types of data and different types of evidence that's out there. And then what do we still need to know? Where's the evidence gap? And how does your paper address this? So for me, I think those are sort of some of the key ingredients for a successful literature review introduction that take the reader through that literature, but also bring it to what you're doing and your original contribution. I would also say, if you're submitting to gerontology or aging journals, I think, avoid generic and sort of cliched statements. I don't need to be told that the global population is aging. I don't think any editor of any gerontology journal does. And it's much more interesting to talk about what's going on in your area where you're studying. So what's the situation of aging if you're doing research in a particular country or in a particular field? What's going on there that makes it interesting for us to look at? I think we're all pretty much aware of these kind of general global trends, and it just sort of seems off-putting. If you're going outside of traditional gerontology journals, then maybe you need to do that. But I certainly think within our field, I think there's a danger that it might irritate, or that it irritates editors and authors. It seems a little bit potentially sort of lazy. The thing that I think is most important, which I've alluded to then, is the methods section. So this is the bit where the editor will be an expert. And also it's crucial for the editor to have confidence to send the paper out to review that they're confident that the methods have been done in a robust way. So that's the bit that you should obviously focus on all the parts of the paper, but I think for me this is the crucial part of the paper in terms of giving the evidence the confidence to kind of send it out, is that they know that the methods are clearly described and robust. Because again, I've been in situations where I think, oh, this is really interesting, definitely can see that there's some value to this, but they haven't described how the sample had been collected, or what the response rate was for their survey, or what questions were used in the questionnaire. And I know that if I send it to a good reviewer, they're just going to come back and ask for that information. So there's no point me sending it out, really, knowing that a reviewer is just going to be angry that they've been sent something that doesn't have the information that allows them to judge whether the study is robust. So you could present these really amazing findings, and the reviewer could say, oh, this is really interesting, and please could you tell me some more about the sample that you've got? And it turns out they talked to 10 people down the local pub for a survey. Let's say this is survey data, and therefore there's no generalizability or sort of robustness in the data collection. So everyone's gone through that process, and then highly likely the reviewer is going to reject the paper on the basis that the methods aren't sound. So I mean, obviously that's a very extreme example, but I've had things that are very close to that, where I sent it out because I think it's interesting and the results look interesting, lack of information about the methods, and it's been rejected after a revise and submit, because when they've supplied the evidence or the detail about the methods, it hasn't been strong enough as a kind of a study design. If you're, whatever country you are doing or whatever area you're doing your research in, I think it is good practice to tell the reader about that. And that goes for if you're doing research in, let's say, the more traditional, well-researched countries around aging, the centers of sort of aging research like the UK, North America, Europe, because your readers don't necessarily know that. And I think we need to get away from a very sort of Western-centric idea that our readers are all based in those parts of the world, and we all know what's going on in those parts of the world. I mean, in fact, I don't know what's going on in parts of the UK. I don't know what's going on in America and Canada. So being told that in the study context as well is really helpful to understand, again, the applicability and the utility of the results from the study as well. So another question that I tend to get asked is whether you should send a letter to the editor. Some journals require this, I think increasingly not all of them. And I think my main sort of question is, it depends what you're trying to do with the letter. A lot of letters that I get as letter to the editor are just kind of formal. Please accept this submission. It hasn't been published anywhere else. With everything else that I've got to do, that doesn't really sort of help me out a great deal. And I think it's, it's probably not worth people's time to do that. However, if you're thinking about using the letter as a way to evidence the originality of your study, to kind of show the editor that you've thought about why you've chosen their journal as a target journal, that you understand the readership of that journal, and that this journal has maybe published other things on this topic, that you're engaging that debate, then I think writing a letter can be really good, and it kind of really shows the editor, okay, this person's thought about all these things that I think about as an editor. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to send it out, but it makes me kind of think, okay, there's definitely a lot of merit to this paper, and clearly they've shown the sorts of things that I'm looking to sort of to do. But that shouldn't be at the as a substitute for putting that stuff, particularly around the originality of the paper, in the paper itself, because that's the thing that's going to go out to the reviewers, who also want to be reminded of the originality of the paper, and also ultimately hopefully will go into your ref submission or be picked up by news outlets or other kind of stakeholder organizations, where you're kind of saying, look, I'm doing something really, really cool here, really interesting, something really new. And I think this is why you sort of should be interested in what I'm doing. Then to sort of come through, if you like, the other part then. So once it's gone out to review the other part of the process where the editor plays this role, in terms of reviewing the reviewer's comments and getting those comments back out to the authors, and how you respond to those, both in terms of the reviewers' comments, but also thinking with about the editor's role in that as well. So the best way of doing this, I think, and again, from my experience of being an editor, is to address each point as they come individually. And that's easy. That makes it easy then for the editor to see that you've engaged with what's been said and how you've responded to it as well. So again, showing that kind of willingness to kind of engage and showing that you've addressed those comments means that the editor can begin to make a decision about whether it goes back out to it has to go back out to the reviewers, maybe whether they can make a decision about it there and then, or whether if they feel that you've not addressed them sufficiently. So again, thinking about editors as, unpaid, under a lot of pressure, anything you can do in order to help demonstrate how you've addressed the comments will go a long way. That doesn't mean you have to agree with all the comments, but where you don't do that, you need to clearly kind of say why that's the case. So maybe you can't, the data don't allow you to do it, but you're aware of that and you'll say something in the limitations section, or you don't feel it's appropriate and you can say why you don't think it's appropriate. Maybe they've asked you to use a particular measure, but that measure hasn't been properly validated, or do certain type of semantic or grounded analysis, which isn't again appropriate for the way in which you've collected the information. So again, just having that conversation, so seeing as a conversation between you, the reviewers, and the editor, helps to kind of go through that process. And again, if it's possible at all, if you can highlight where you've made changes in the text, again, not all journals will allow you to do this, but where you can, it just speeds up the process again for the reviewer and the editor, particularly if you're going to get just sort of like, minor revisions. They don't want to be wading through your paper again to try to find where you've made these kind of small comments or these small adjustments. But if you can clearly identify in the paper where you've done that, they can go there and say, oh yeah, I can see that sort of makes sense as to what we have. So then the last one that I really wanted to talk about, and I'm not going to say much here, was just thinking about how to make your paper more discoverable. So again, when you're starting to, when you're thinking about ultimately getting the paper published, how can you improve the chance that it's going to be picked up by the people that you think you want to read it? So there's a number of links here to various resources for a number of publishers that might help you think about doing that, which I think are really useful. And then finally, just a plug for the journal, because it would be remiss of me to come on here and not do that. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing now, and hopefully there's some time for some questions.